Welcome to the Samueletini Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to another episode of the show. And today we are going back to the points of Africa. We are going to Cape Town to meet assistant architect and an entrepreneur and discuss again emerging markets and how really Africa is shaping the conversation in the space. So I'm very pleased to have here today Tonderai Njowera. Tonderai, it's such a pleasure having you at the show today.
Thank you very much for having me, Samuele. I appreciate it.
Tonderai, you have a very diverse career, engineering, water, and then you went to finance, venture building, entrepreneurship. So what is your story?
Thank you very much for that amazing question. My story starts, it's a mix of two experiences, particularly what happened in 2003 when my dad visited Durban to help his colleague to collect one of his two vehicles, which he had bought when he was on his United Nations peacekeeping mission. I've forgotten where exactly. So it was sometime in December. Dad comes back home after collecting the cars and then says, "Son, did you know that you can own a highway?" And I was amazed. How can someone own a highway? And then he explains, we've been using toll gates in South Africa. We've actually been paying to use someone's highway. So fast forward 11 years later, in 2014, I'm sitting in my lecture, transportation engineering, and I've started studying civil engineering. And I asked the lecturer, how can one own a highway? And during that particular time, I picked a transportation book. The roads in Zimbabwe were also being rehabilitated by a company called Group 5. And we could travel that road that was being rehabilitated from Nast, which is in Bulawayo, where I was studying, to Harare, which is where I grew up. So that conversation then helped me to realize that we had an infrastructure lack that needed serious addressing. And it's still something that the governments are working on. And then the question I then asked myself was, how best can I contribute towards infrastructure development instead of only through just being a civil engineer? And I decided, let me get into investments management to understand how these things happen, how project finance works. And that became the sort of the beginning of the journey before I actually finished my undergrad studies.
That is fantastic. Really, from a question, then started a career, I would say.
Absolutely.
And then all the journey from Zimbabwe now in South Africa. And really, since you have become an entrepreneur, a discussion in investment. So I want to ask one of the questions. We talk a lot about the future market, and especially from your perspective on Southern Africa. So what are the challenges and and the opportunities, especially for entrepreneurs, for founders in these areas?
I think in terms of opportunities, one of the things I love about entrepreneurship and being a founder is there's always a very, very big opportunity to learn. So learning is one of the biggest opportunities that I think is out there. Learning across many fundamentals. Is it strategy? Is it business management? Is it learning about people? Is it learning about culture? There's a lot to learn out there in terms of one being a founder. And I think it's sort of the biggest opportunity that is there, and it's not only there for founders and entrepreneurs, but anyone who wants to lead, wants to be a big contributor within the most important aspects of the life that we live. So I think I would say the biggest opportunity is the opportunity of learning, and it happens wherever you are. You don't have to be in a specific place. You don't have to be in a specific sector. But yes, it is learning. I think that's the biggest opportunity that is out there.
And I think it's really important. From learning, then it goes to the practice in a way. And if you have to say this, which sectors, because you mentioned that, which sectors do you think are really scalable? That's the really, let's say, this one can be a sector I want to jump in.
I will try to be as objective as possible and throw away the engineering hat. But I will start from what I think is understanding infrastructure from the origins of the word itself. Infrastructure comes basically from a word that talks about foundations. So I believe that infrastructure in its different verticals, you've got transport and logistics, you've got water supply and sanitation, you've got some of the conversations are getting into defense and resilience. So it could be defense and resilience across multiple areas. We also talk around agricultural infrastructure in itself. We talk of digital infrastructure. So I would say infrastructure across the board, across those different verticals, as well as so looking at those verticals, we then step into the products and services across infrastructure. So infrastructure products being the highways within, for example, transportation and logistics, and then the other ones across the other verticals. And within the value chain of infrastructure, we then talk about the materials that are used in infrastructure. So if you're looking at digital infrastructure, what are the materials that are used for digital infrastructure? Those again are the sectors that really do scale. And why would I be sort of convinced? It's simply because of the different trends that are happening across innovation as well as population growth. Those are definite fundamentals and drivers that make sure that infrastructure moves in terms of scale. The other place I would talk about is obviously agriculture. Agriculture, not only because it drives infrastructure, but it also talks to the fundamental of population growth. It talks to the fundamental of climate change, for example. There are different innovations that need to happen across agriculture, and those open up for scaling. And moving back to the point of infrastructure, which I was talking about, infrastructure materials themselves, but over and above that, it then gets into mining, materials development, manufacturing. So not only manufacturing in terms of mined resources, but also food manufacturing. The other one which I would talk about is tourism and hospitality. I believe it actually makes very much sense within an African perspective from a capabilities point of view. I think there's a lot of hospitality to be explored within the African continent. But I mean, I would go on and on just to paint the better picture. The way I look at it is around system and seeing where the fundamentals are going in terms of what could become human needs that are inevitable. So what is inevitable for the human race, and not negating the other ecosystems players across the board.
But it's really critical what you're saying, and especially, I mean, we live in the continent. We know that I really like, infrastructure, agriculture, and tourism, and especially infrastructure across the board is what we lack. Logistics. You mentioned from the road to the logistics to the other. I want to ask this question. Sometimes people say, "Fantastic, we know that." But how and this is a question a bit also provocative because we know that especially our governments bring in infrastructure and people from abroad. We have the Chinese, especially now Chinese contractor and other. And one of the things that I often get from entrepreneurs say, how we local entrepreneurs be empowered, how can be the protagonist of our infrastructure development and not get eaten alive by competition that is coming in.
That's an important part of the conversation, and it speaks to some of the challenges that we face as coming from the continent. That challenge, particularly being the challenge of leadership, and I'm not talking about leadership in terms of political leadership, but leadership in the sense that as entrepreneurs, as systems thinkers, as systems architects, for example, one of the greatest challenges that we face is global competition, and the response to that is, instead of limited localized thinking, we really have to step up and lead in terms of thinking globally wherever we decide to go. I speak about this because even from a Chinese perspective, if the Chinese business leader is sitting in their office or they're on a site, definitely they are also facing competition from different areas across the globe. And it is now an issue of stepping up and saying, how best do we lead? So leadership then becomes the challenge that helps us to navigate competition across the board. Whether it's from a European, it's from an American perspective, the opportunities are always going there. And the usual example that I would love to give is an example of Formula One. Speaking about innovation and competition, we've got 11 teams now on the grid, with Cadillac recently joining. But usually it's the same track, it's the same conditions. But one determinant that determines the best drivers, the best teams on the grid, are obviously being able to compete within those challenging conditions. So I think it goes back to the challenge of leadership, and being able to lead into uncharted territories for most of our companies, but also founders, and being able to understand where can value be extracted, where can value be added within the global markets and not just the local market. So I believe again it goes back to the point that we said earlier on. There's a lot of learning potential, but then the challenge is to lead. The challenge is to step up.
Especially, I would say that is important because, of course, there is maybe a mentality, if I can recap, is that the mentality, oh, we need to protect, we need to close ourselves, while you are saying, no, let's open up, let's be also us, actors that can be not only confined in our, in our state, in our country, or maybe even our province, but we need to be open up and really as they also be protagonists in the competition and war. And if I have to ask this, how really we can evaluate the business that can be, ready for this sort of step, which is usually not the step that we say, because sometimes we say we need to protect. So how we can change that mentality.
And again, a very, very important question. I think it's honestly a long term game. And it goes back again to the point of infrastructure that we mentioned earlier on. We've got certain principles that are foundational. In terms of changing mentality, I would say again it goes back to an issue of leadership, but to be sort of specific, it's a systemic leadership challenge in the sense that within our educational systems as a start, because education is the foundation for innovation. So if people do understand some of the principles that allow or that stifle creativity, that allow people to be confident enough to play on the global stage. As I'm actually thinking, I'm remembering some of the activities that we used to do in primary school, for example. And I think that helped a lot. But you can imagine these are things that happened in the late 1990s. So the primary school that I was attending, it put us through creative activities. And I would say those creative activities have sort of over the long term helped us to have a sort of a solid creative mentality that allows us to be able to challenge and say we need to be protagonists, we need to be part of the creative game, we need to be systems architects, as it were. So over and above the education, there's obviously need for exposure, there's need for support, but these are long-term investments that I wouldn't want to give the responsibility to government. But as architects, as entrepreneurs, I think we can take that upon ourselves, trying to see maybe what policies can we take advantage of instead of then saying, we're going to wait for the government. I mean, at the end of the day, who is the government? I believe it's not the people that are leading in the presidium, the people that are in parliament. And I believe the government are those that decide to say, we are the leaders and we are willing to do what it takes in terms of helping innovation and driving innovation in ways that are productive for the economies, whether locally as well as internationally. So yeah, it's thinking in the long term. It's having that long term mindset to say, where do we need to activate our talents? Where do we need to activate our potential? I remember again, there's a there's a there's an advert that used to say investing in potential, and I took that advert when I was still quite a young boy. So yeah, we need to invest in potential. If I would say that's a phrase I would use to answer your question.
And it's very interesting because sometimes now we also here we have a saying that Serekalis idea, so that can translate loosely government help. Instead, I like the change, that is proactivity and people, which really can also transform, this sort of lack of agency that it is also maybe framed in many cooperation projects, in many approaches with the African continent. No, we need to help the poor African man or woman. Like I think they have more agency. They don't need any or government intervention. And if I have to go practical, for example, also in your diverse career, can you give maybe some examples on how you can do it in practice? Maybe some yes story, some no story that you have seen in investments and entrepreneurship journey.
I will answer the yes no stories from a principles perspective. So because we have challenges that require long term thinking. I would say my yes story is from a long term thinking perspective. being reliable, being accountable, I would say is something that embodies long-term thinking. And the North story would be again something that stifles long-term thinking, which is basically short-termism. And within the markets, I mean, we can pick up a couple of examples from the macro and the micro that deal with short-term thinking. Practical examples that I could actually give. I would say it's really through conversations that I've had with people. So there are conversations that you stay and you want to take long into the future. Then there are those conversations that you then decide I'm really not going to focus. And again, within a relationship building perspective, some of these are actually very personal to me. Some personal relationships that I've been involved in. I wouldn't really say from a product or service sales perspective, but some of the relationships I have had to walk away are relationships that have a lot of short-term thinking and a lot of stifling control. And the longer term ones, not that it started well, but these are conversations and relationships that have had to go through challenges, being tested, but because of patience, parties realize that this is how best we can sort of work together. And you come together with people and you say, this is what I'm working on, these are my personal goals, this is what I'm deciding to invest time in. Are you willing to help in sort of whatever way that you can come in? And without being specific, I would say those are the yes and the no stories in a nutshell. To be honest, it would require a longer conversation to talk about some of these personal stories. But again, to just go back to how I've then framed it in my mind to say I'm going to move forward. I'll give another personal experience, which I believe I can actually talk about. Back in 2019, I started a job. It was with one of the sugar plantations in Zimbabwe. And unfortunately, I was involved in an accident. Why did it become a yes positive story, even though it was a fatal accident? It was a yes story because it's got an infrastructure component. One of the reasons why the accident happened was because, in fact, we were overtaking a haulage truck. And as we were overtaking the haulage truck, the highway we were traveling on was very narrow. So there was a bit of panic in the driver because of the fact that some of the wheels actually went off the road as we were navigating the passing maneuver. And up ahead of the road there was a car that was coming our direction, and we overturned. From the accident scene, we were taken to a clinic that was close by. There wasn't much in terms of service at that particular clinic. We had to wait for ambulances. We had to travel 200 or so kilometers to go to the nearest hospital where we could get some help. So it's a yes story because of the challenge that needed to be addressed, the patience that's also required to address the long-term challenge. Yeah, I think that's a best example that I can give in terms of a yes story. The no stories, I think we can reserve those for another day.
No, that is interesting, and it's also something that I experience. The same thing. We know our narrow roads. Then I was in West Africa that day, and then the lorry comes in front of you, full headlights. You move the other side, and then a trailer is parked. So you get some. So that is the thing of like being patient, being really steady, and also understand also the context. I would frame it where you are, and especially our context. And I want to go back to what you say, short term and long term. So if there is something, in your the ecosystem, how we can really frame that cultural shift, because everything is pushing short term, short term, short term. But then how we can move away from that?
So I love that question because as you are asking the question and we are talking about the interventions that we need, there's the yin and the yang principle, the and principle. So going back to the infrastructure conversation, and now to expand the word infrastructure, this is physical infrastructure, this is cultural infrastructure, anything that you can think of that needs a foundation. Within these spaces, within these markets, within these sectors, we have activities that are going to thrive on the long term. So we need to embrace the long term thinking, and we need to embrace also the fact that There are long-term thinkers and there are short-term thinkers. And the long-term thinkers are the ones that obviously have the bigger picture at the end of the day, and those sort of become the leaders into the future. It doesn't negate the importance of short-termism, but short-termism shouldn't then stifle long-term thinking, because it becomes an issue of how best can we mix the dose of long-term thinking with a dose of short-term thinking, because short-term thinking allows us to move from where we are to the next step and to the next step, but across that whole long-term vision. But to bring it back to the question itself, my humble view is that, going back to the leadership conversation, if I am going to have the deeper long-term thinking, I shouldn't then go onto people and sort of try to make it the only thing that is available. I have to understand that within the long-term activities, there are short-term activities that need to be undertaken. And then it then becomes an issue of mixing the long-term perspective as well as what needs to be done in the short term. In terms of navigating the vices, most of our thinking, and as we look, political cycles, banking cycles, loan cycles, they sort of happen within the short term. But one of the beautiful things that I'm beginning to see within the markets, from a practical perspective now, again, I want to underscore the point of being able to understand what's required from a short-term perspective and what's required from a long-term perspective. Let's talk about venture capital and venture investing, for example. It does look at the shorter cycles, the quickest cycles of how to get through. On the other side of venture capital, you've got a grant, and you don't want to just bring a grant and say, let's give this grant and it's free money. That grant needs to serve a purpose within the long term game. Venture capital needs to serve a purpose within the long term game. You look at instruments from multilateral development banks, for example, from development banks, development finance institutions. They need to bridge the gap between projects that are incapable of producing returns as they are needed by venture capitalists, for example. You then bring in the layer of commercial banking. It's still short term, but it's also part of the longer term picture. And then you've got other institutional investors like your pension funds that have got sort of a long term view, but within strict mandates where it comes to where they're supposed to invest. So essentially, what I'm just saying is, there are those foundational investors like development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, grant seekers, and philanthropists. They've got a layer that they can actually fulfill in that game. Then short term sort of investors do bring an important bit. The other form of investor that I then want to talk about that brings in the longer term perspective are the family offices. So basically, to sum up everything, it's being able to understand who can plug what part of the longer term vision, whether they're short term, they're medium term, or they're long term in terms of their thinking as well as their mandates. So being able to bring these stakeholders together, I think it will do us a lot of good in the end of at the end of the day.
And that is actually, I think the subsequent question, that I want really to summarize a bit the work. So from your perspective, really in South Africa and all the southern market, what would you like, to see more to really fulfill that potential? You spoke about the potential, the potential of the African century that we discuss a lot, the potential of our country, the potential of the youth. So what do you see more? How do you see maybe in the 3-5 year evolving the situation?
I believe that there's a lot of growth that is happening given the fundamental shifts that are happening globally. I'll give an example of gold prices, for example, just as something to look at for the audience. We honestly don't know where the gold prices are going. We don't know where the interest rates are going. And without that fuller picture of where everything is going, I would say it's the same as what sort of happened during the COVID times, where there was sort of a reset button that was pressed. And so that's going to continue. It's not a short-term outlook. I wouldn't predict it to be short-term, but it's a reset that is happening across the globe, and it's sort of bringing people right on the starting line. But it will not look that way unless someone decides to see it that way, because of competition, a lot is happening on the global markets. But for that entrepreneur who decides to see the reset, I believe that's going to help in terms of boosting the confidence, like we said earlier on. That allows us as players coming from the back foot, if you want, to be able to participate on the global markets. Again, tapping from Formula One. For those that do watch Formula One, I watched a couple of races where the underdogs ended up on the podium simply because they were able to capitalize the conditions of the day. And in this particular case, the conditions of the day are the fundamental changes that are happening within the global ecosystem, within the global markets that we can choose to embrace. Going back to the first part of the conversation, if we are able to allow ourselves to learn, how do we, for example, translate macroeconomic events into the micro as entrepreneurs? If we're able to do that, if we're able to make decisions based on that, if we're able to strategize and get into the market based off of that, some mistakes are going to be made, but at the end of the day, I remember listening to one of the former British prime ministers saying that you need someone to break eggs to make some omelette. So breaking eggs in a way that is helpful to the economies, but that allows us to participate within the global ecosystem. And in a nutshell, I'll just say it's an issue of being part of the changes that are happening across the globe, leadership as it is. That I think as entrepreneurs we need to do over the next 3 to 5 years so that we can pivot into the longer term.
And that is fantastic. I really like these two sentences, the example of Formula One, because, that's the power of storytelling, really embracing the conditions, using your leadership, and really have also this sort of long-term vision, notwithstanding that short terms is also important, also to navigate. And what I really take out of this conversation is really how to be bold also as people, with education, with leadership, not to be afraid, to get out and really get towards a more globalized and compete, even if we are, let's say, as Africa, underdogs in these markets. So there is been a pleasure and honor having you, and really, I really thank you for the time of sharing your knowledge and the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Samuel. It's been a pleasure having this conversation, and I've learned one or two things. And yes, like you are saying, it's about boldness and creativity, because we are in very, very exciting times.
Fantastic. Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.